Good afternoon, colleagues. A really warm welcome to this session of SLF. Can I introduce myself first? My name's Joan Mackay. I work with Education Scotland, and on the screen I'm hoping you're seeing two other faces at the moment, and if not, I'm going to ask them both to wave so they know who we're talking about. One is Elizabeth Maguire, if you can give a wave there. So I work closely with Elizabeth on curriculum innovation and design. And we've been working over the past 2 years with our partner, Ewan McIntosh of notosh, who should also give you a wave. And Ewan is the person who's going to lead through almost all of this session here today. So I was just wanting to do some joins as we begin this. Some of you will be aware that the refresh narrative for Scotland's curriculum was published in September 2019. Note the timing. And we had a whole plan of work ready to run through 2019, 2020, 2021, based on what people asked us, and all the practitioners and teachers who worked with us in producing the narrative. There was a long list. So if I give you a feeling for some of the things on the list, people said, can we revisit interdisciplinary learning? Now, we did manage to do a piece of work with that. Can we look again in the secondary at learning pathways in the senior phase? We did manage to do some work on that. A big ask in secondaries for help with imaginative timetabling. Across all stages, can we look again at 4 capacities? We're just beginning some work on 4 capacities, so I'm going to put an invitation out there to anyone who's on this call. If you're doing something in that area, or you want to do something in that area, please get in touch with us. Leave something in the chat or contact Elizabeth immediately after this session. So a lot going on, but here's the big thing. A really interesting ask about how do we tell our stories? How do we tell the story of our curriculum? Now, sometimes that's called curriculum rationale, and a really big ask for that, and we began to explore all of that. But sitting alongside that, we were wanting to invest ourselves to learn something about how we engage others and engage ourselves and skill ourselves up in design skills, sometimes called service design. How do you apply service design skills to something like the curriculum, which is a service? It's a service we offer children and young people in all our communities. How do we do that? And so we were pretty confident, but we wanted to do that in partnership with somebody else who would who we could learn from and with as well. So hence Ewan McIntosh runs a company called notosh, and he spends his life, from what we can see, jetting all over the world to fascinating places to do service design thinking with schools and organisations. He can tell you that himself. So we asked Ewan to stand in and help us from the start of round about 2020. We managed to make some really good progress, and then something called COVID came and we had to go underground, or not quite. So Ewan did manage to carry on some of the work, and this is what we're going to hear about today. So real welcome to everybody, and hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Oh, thanks very much. And, what I would ask everyone to make sure is that your microphone's on mute, just so that we don't hear your conversations and your own reactions to some of the stories that I'm going to share today. So it's a real pleasure to be sharing these stories today. It's 14 years since the last time I spoke at a Scottish Learning Festival, and in those 14 years, things have changed significantly. And I've heard those changes through many of the stories I've been listening to over the past little while. To recap a little on what Joan gave as an introduction, the Curriculum Story Project was born really of something that began back in 2019. We had really a co-design project between practitioners around the country, around 80 practitioners coming together to try and define what interdisciplinary learning was, give examples of how they planned for learner pathways, and then to develop recommendations for fellow practitioners, but also for leaders and for government. And the white papers, or the thought papers that were developed on the back of that, were submitted as part of the OECD's work that led to some of the reforms that we've seen being suggested and kicking in this year. Most importantly, though, isn't so much the big the big headlines you might see in a newspaper around reforms, but instead the work of practitioners to create change. And that is where the Curriculum Story project took on even more relevance this year. We created a short online program to support better storytelling, and I would invite anyone here who wants to learn how to tell their own story even better to drop a line to us, and we will add you to this prototype that we're trying at the moment, trying to help practitioners tell their stories even better. And in June, my team then undertook in-depth interviews with practitioners, really focusing in on the impact of the work that they were doing. What we discovered is that we really need to tell these stories, but package them up as well with some support so that the story of one school can go on to influence the story of 100 schools. And that is what we're hoping to commence from around late October, sharing concrete stories of success, of trials and tribulations, and the capacity then to download a pack to use in your own professional learning workshops at school, for example. The Curriculum Story project was even more important to capture the lessons being learned during this tricky period. There is a story from this past 2 years, and it's a story that needs told. And one of the participant teachers in the project said this: when we get back, this is what we want to do more of. We want to do more storytelling. We want to change our practices by learning from experiences. It's all too easy to try to go back to normal. And we hear talk of recovery, which implies that we are going to somehow go back to where we were before. And the desire of the 126 educators who took part in this project was not to go back to the way things were before, but instead seize on what they had learned during this process to do things differently. I mean, what does it take to engage every learner at whatever stage they are and ensure that they can seize all the opportunities in their life? And from the early days of this emerging crisis on the other side of the world in January 2020 through to today, teams at my firm at Notosh and in Education Scotland have been working together with this group of practitioners across the country to work this out. And one of the key barriers to moving quicker on the development of an ever more relevant curriculum has been the language surrounding it. For more than a decade, people have talked about the importance of interdisciplinary learning, or IDL, but there hasn't really been a clear definition of what it means in practice, and the practice didn't really follow any nationwide scale. There were lots of pockets of things going on, but not really a single unifying definition of what we meant when we talked about IDL. And the past 3 or 4 years' work on learner pathways has perhaps highlighted more what goes on in secondary schools work around developing the young workforce than in those systems and practices in, say, the early years, for example, that help set up young people to have greater ambition and wherewithal to exploit that ambition throughout the whole of their lives. And finally, the stories of the practitioners making change happen have traditionally been quite hard to surface. And if anything, this challenging 18 months has brought more opportunities online to tell those stories, whether it's through Scottish Learning Festival or the myriad of pop-up events that have happened online over the past year and a half. So we designed the Curriculum Story project to do 3 things. First of all, to define what interdisciplinary learning is, its features, its point, its purpose, and what it's definitely not. Second, to understand just how far early years settings, primary and secondary schools can go in bending old concepts of timetabling, of disciplines, of even the physical space and the responsibilities we expect to hand over to children, asking how can we open up horizons earlier, help young people spot more opportunities in their lives, and then equip them through different types of experiences so they can actually follow their pathways. And the third thing was that we wanted to help practitioners tell their own stories better. We wanted to start.
Ewan, can I just
Yes.
interrupt? Are you sharing just now? Because we're not seeing anything.
No, not sharing.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
And I'll be zipping in and out. I hate staring at PowerPoint for 40 minutes.
That's lovely. So, I just was worried. That's
no worries at all. So yeah, we want to ask how we could create a movement of storytelling that inspires even more people to mimic stories, mimic practice, and then make it their own. So what I want to share today is really an overview of some of those stories, share some of the lessons learned, and then later this year you'll be able to access those stories firsthand, and be able to go into some of the detail about how people have gone about that work, and hopefully copy some of it and reinvent it and make it your own. And when we asked people what they wanted to do more of as they emerged from the pandemic and what they wanted to ditch, there were some clear trends emerging early on. We used a framework to think about that question around what's changed and what do we want to do more of. And it's a really useful framework for anyone to consider using, perhaps in a staff meeting, in a team meeting, when you're trying to work out where are we today and where do we want to go next. And it was borrowed from Ian Burbridge's work at the RSA. We asked people, what do you want to amplify? All those silver linings that have come from the pandemic, although it's a challenging and somewhat hellish time for most of us at some point, there are also silver linings, particularly for education. So how do we seize upon those? We want to ask what you want to eliminate, elements you had to undertake for the crisis, but they're not adding so much value now and there's no need. Things you want to let go of. So with the pandemic, we probably stopped some activities. And today we're maybe asking why on earth we would want to resume them now, because they weren't adding value before. And then finally, are there things we need to restart and change? And this is a really useful way, almost you could use this to chart all your learning through the Scottish Learning Festival this year, all those fresh ideas that arise, where do you plot them and how do they affect your work? You could do this individually or you could do it as a team. When we undertook this with practitioners, we saw, first of all, a lot in the top right-hand corner, which is really reassuring. Although it's been a challenging year, it's also been a very creative year for many people. People have managed to really pull out of nowhere, perhaps, the energy to create plenty of new ideas and plenty of things that they want to change. They've got an opportunity for renewal. In that top right-hand corner of elements people wanted to amplify, there were 7 key kind of themes, and they're all connected, 7 themes that emerged. The first is that people want to manage the balance between expectations and outcomes, those printed documents, and learners' actual starting point. And that means that rather than relying on paperwork to plan curriculum, we rely on learners and where they're actually starting. The second thing, sorry, could I ask you please to ensure that you're on mute, just so that your microphone isn't on. Thank you very much. And second of all, we want to use a design cycle to plan for learning. A lot of folk traditionally have planned for learning on pro formas, on a very linear kind of way. What we saw emerging was the use of language from the world of service design and design thinking, people using set cycles or frameworks to plan for learning in a more cyclical way, and in a way that leaves room for meaningful tangents, so that when children come up with their own questions, there's wiggle room for them to go off and answer them. Third, the importance of thinking skills is paramount. Children need to be able to think for themselves in order to take more responsibility for their learning. Through the pandemic, we saw children having to take ever-increasing responsibility for their learning, and where they did that most successfully is where the thinking skills were taught and not caught, where they were planned as much as the content and knowledge was. Fourth, professional learning is, in some of the best stories, seen as a team effort, not as an individual thing that you work out on your own. So a lot of people at the moment are probably doing their own PRD. Many people, unfortunately, still see it as a bit of a burden rather than an opportunity to work with the team and create a team effort to improve practice and to learn something new. The best stories see it as a team effort. Fifth, we saw curriculum design as an exercise in prototyping. Rather than the expectation that curriculum is something that has to be created, be perfect, and then done, it's something that is continually evolving. And that means that every practitioner, and in many stories as well, we saw students themselves, young people themselves, as co-designers of curriculum. It is messier, but it's a lot more rewarding. It's faster to find out what works and what doesn't work, and the ultimate product at the end is better for it. Sixth, partnerships kept coming up as a real core ingredient in curriculum development. If you're a school, a teacher, a department trying to design curriculum on your own without partnerships outside the school, then the chances are it won't be as rich and rewarding as if it would be had you involved partners from the get-go. And finally, a point that is still a hard one to pitch. Success is not about exam results alone. This was a point that was resonating before the pandemic came along. It's been resonating in our ears for the last 18 months. And yet, I fear we are still falling for the trap that somehow we have a singular unit of success that involves 5-letter A's after a student's name. And what we're seeing is that in the best stories, that the most exciting stories that I was hearing about from practitioners, success is much richer, deeper, broader than that. And it's about what's right for the young people, not what's right for the institution. So I'm going to focus today on 4 of those areas. I'm going to attempt to share some stories from each of those 4 areas and highlight some of the practice that's been going on from early year settings all the way through to secondary and all over the country in incredibly rural areas where there are 6 children in the school through to massive secondary schools with thousands of learners. To be honest, there is more in common than there are differences between these places, and I hope that the spread of stories begins to show that. So let me dive in to 4 interesting areas in more depth. And the first one is this notion of using a design cycle. Using a design cycle to plan for learning, but leaving room for those meaningful tangents. And let me first of all just explain what a design cycle is in case you've not come up against one before. I'm going to show you 2 examples just to point out that there's no right answer to this. There are many, many more. This was initially a provocation around the use of a design cycle that my team used back in January, February 2020, when we were working initially on what interdisciplinary learning might look like. The Singapore American School is an incredibly large 4,000 student school in Singapore, and we worked with them to develop a catalyst project in the final year of high school, so really on the sharp, pointy end of those learners' experience. But we wanted to open up part of the week and part of the day, every day, where young people would take complete control over what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, and what the end product would look like. This is a design cycle. You've got a period of self-awareness, so thinking about what interests you, where your strengths are, what you want your project to be about, defining SMART goals so that you can actually create something meaningful from those passions and interests, but which also ties maybe to some form of curricular competence. And then we have 3 really important elements. A framework, a project-based learning framework. So where are the thinking skills going to come from to help you achieve? Project management, so learning how to collaborate. It's not a given that people know how to do that. So how are you going to collaborate? And then finally, feedback and revision. So how do you go and get feedback from people outside your bubble? And then finally, of course, how do you communicate your ideas clearly? So that's a cycle. It's pretty linear. And within each of those coloured boxes, kids do go round in circles, but mentorship underpins the whole thing to try and keep students on track. Another project that we're working on at the moment in Romania in our team, Colina Nua, is based around the idea of expeditions. Again, it's an interdisciplinary way of mastering knowledge and skills. The design cycle there is much more metaphorical, like climbing Everest. We have an initial provocation, first footsteps, an exploration, then summit shaping as we think about converging our thinking and coming to a hypothesis, and then adventure's end. How do we create a worthy product of our learning? How do we show the impact of our learning? And I show you this above all to reassure you that you can create your own design cycle. There is no right answer to what a design cycle should be, merely that children understand what it is so that they can use it. So when we consider this idea of using a design cycle, a couple of things pop up, 3 really important elements that make it worthwhile. 1, having a design cycle gives a common language of learning for planning learning amongst teachers. 2, It helps you move on from kind of mundane one-size-fits-all contexts or themes to much more focused provocations that can inspire a whole range of questions from young people themselves. And third, the whole design cycle and design thinking has a bias towards collaboration and working together. Now, this is useful for young people, obviously, but it's really useful for practitioners who are looking about how to share planning, share teaching, and share assessment. And that sharing of planning, teaching, and assessment is one of the hardest, but probably one of the most important, unique aspects of quality interdisciplinary learning. Without it, you might be doing some thematic stuff, you might be doing some project-based learning, but when you share the planning, the teaching and assessment, you really can take learning and teaching to a different level. I'm going to take you to a couple of examples to explain what I mean by that. First of all, to East Kilbride, Calderglen High School has been using design thinking as an approach to teaching and learning where you might expect it in the craft design technology department. But they've also really embraced it as a methodology for thinking through their own strategy and their approach to learning and teaching. It's helped them think big. It's helped them target their equity funding really effectively. So, for example, as part of their pupil equity, their PEF funding, they were able to pay for an office staff member who was understretched to step up and take on a different focus. And for that person, they created a new post, a family liaison worker. And so she was seconded with her salary during the pandemic, working with families on technology so that everyone is able to access the learning and teaching, whatever background and whatever skill set they have with technology. It's been indispensable. She's been using data on attendance and performance to target who she'll work with. But she can also make connections between their qualifications, how they're performing, and the pathway they're thinking of choosing. She's able to make those connections and take those decisions thanks to skilling up in that. It's a good example of the right person in a totally new job. And Calderglen have really looked afresh at everything. They have what you would maybe call a designer's eye, thanks to using a design cycle in everything that they do. So by creating a new position and giving these new responsibilities to someone who would normally perhaps be a DHT, this member of staff was instead able to spot fourth year kids who were not engaging at all during that lockdown back in January. And she was able to co-design and report on the impact of 58 individual attainment plans in S4, 18 of them in S5, and help those young people remove the barriers that were in the way of them progressing. You know, she'd phone the house to find out what they needed. Do they need a Chromebook or do they need help in some other way? She would have day-to-day conversations, and day-to-day conversations like this that would normally fall onto the plate of a harried, busy deputy head teacher, or more likely fall between the cracks. Instead of that, they were able to get to all of those students who were struggling into the campus a couple of times a week to get them re-engaged, to get them up in their game. Calderglen also were very clear in defining what they thought was a vulnerable learner. And a vulnerable learner for them simply means not learning. So they were able to bring them in during lockdown as a vulnerable learner and have that individualized attention to help them get to where they want to be. And they've even had former staff coming back in as a kind of dream team on secondment to work with the 25 pupils who are really needing that targeted support to tie up loose ends. A really interesting point here that is different from just being a linear process of getting stuff done is that when you think in a circular way and you're really designing, you're always asking what next. So when they tie up those loose ends with those 25 young people, they don't do that without asking what next. And so putting these students into a mainstream class, just saying, you know, come back after summer and plonk yourselves in a mainstream class, that's not going to work. They need looked after, they need nurtured, they need to have conversations about learning. And so they are celebrating their successes as they hit their achievements, hit their assessments and achieve what might have fallen between the cracks, but they're being, they've had a relationship crafted for them by a new member of staff. Leadership has really been key there. Deputies have been freed up from maybe dealing with that minutiae to focus on larger mainstream groups. It means there's little cynicism really about the focus on relatively small numbers of students. I think had the DHTs been chasing students on the lower end, the ones who were struggling, they'd never have had the chance to raise the achievement of everyone else. And so they're able to look after that large group. They know each kid's current achievement and where they're focused next. They have them take up that responsibility. Pupil support managers take up that responsibility, freeing DHTs instead to look at how they can boost those kids who could get to National 5s where they otherwise might have settled for a National 4. And so, for example, you've got maths teachers working with kids to make marginal gains, the smallest things they can do to move from a C to a B or from a National 4 to a National 5. And lockdown has meant that they had to give more autonomy to young people. Not having a timetable meant that they had more flexibility. And so they really exploited that flexibility to have uninterrupted conversations about learning and teaching and what they were trying to achieve. And the deputy head teacher was then able to get more of an understanding of the subject areas that they were looking after. Getting the right people into the right role is the key message from Calder Glen. You've got to be passionate about the phase in which you're working, and that passion around using a design cycle to plan not just learning, but to plan your operations and really design the right people for the right job. You see it everywhere, even in small schools like Badcall and Scorrig, out on the West Coast. Their shared planning is something that the lockdown freed them up to do. They were able to have much more time together to share planning, even with the children. So they didn't just do shared planning between the teachers, they did shared planning with young people themselves. They wanted pupils to ask more questions than the teachers, because they felt that if pupils ask the questions, it's naturally going to be of more interest to each one of them. And all those questions are really unforeseeable moments, turning points in the class, in the plan. And so the most important tool for them was starting a wonder wall, a wall where all those questions of wonder can be kind of held in a holding pattern while the teachers regroup and think about where that might fit best into the days and weeks ahead. And not being afraid to have really quite a loose framework for planning the content, but a very strong framework for assessment. And at Badcall and Scorrig, they used the solo taxonomy to share assessment with children, getting children to think about how together their understanding was. If you want to find out more about solo taxonomy, that's one of the elements we will create a little info pack on, so you can run a PD session on your class. How do you move from understanding individual bits of knowledge to holding it together, to then having a much greater conceptual understanding of what's going on ahead? And you'll see also schools like Dice School up in Aberdeen, where the design cycle for their expeditions is ludicrously simple. Explore, design, create, and share. Even a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old can remember those 4 stages. And that's the importance of a design cycle. It gives a shared, simple, common language for everyone to get involved in co-designing learning, not just the teachers. So Elizabeth, Joan, I don't know if I hope I've explained some of that clearly enough, and I don't know if there are questions coming to mind. The one thing we should have said is please use the chat as well to pose your questions in the remainder of this session. We've got another 15 minutes or so, but if there are questions coming to mind, you pose them there. Liz.
There aren't any questions in the chat at the moment, Ewan, but I suppose just to say that we are seeing a huge appetite for design thinking skills. With a session running at SLF on Thursday where we're promoting a curriculum design toolkit. I'm just about to put a presentation into the chat, and it's got our contact details and it's got some of the information about that. So please do get in touch if it's of interest to you after hearing what Ewan's had to say.
Brilliant. And I think it's it's not an easy thing to bite off, because it's not just about throwing throwing expectations and outcomes into a slot in a design cycle. It's also about the skills young people have themselves to think like designers. And those thinking skills are the second point that I wanted to pick up on. If the first point is around using a design cycle to think through how you want to plan learning, the second one is this: thinking skills need planned too, just as much as content. With that greater flexibility that you get when you're planning with maybe a looser framework, comes a greater responsibility for learners, and that responsibility needs to be supported by really strong thinking skills. And those thinking skills are best taught rather than caught. Some schools have gone as far as creating what you might call a curriculum of thinking skills with connections to employability, the world of work, and pathways that some learners may never have thought of before. One of my favorite examples, I think, honestly, in the past 5-6 years that I've seen, has come from Crown Primary School in Inverness. Hannah Earnshaw and Kat Morton, both teachers at the school, believe that learners need to recognise skills and the language of skills to be able to use them, and those skills need planned out. And what you're seeing here is one of their pieces of documentation. I'll show you in a little bit more detail. One of their pieces of documentation around planning those thinking skills. Not planning skills as clearly as we might plan content means that an individual teacher themselves might be strong in one area, like creativity, but not another, like critical analysis. So that skill that they're not particularly keen on or confident in gets left off the programme altogether or gets left to chance. And at Crown Primary School in Inverness, they didn't want to leave it to chance. They wanted to have a more solid foundation, a more reliable system, if you like, for knowing that children, as they progress through the school, gain and practice deliberately different types of skills, so that they want to know what young people can do for themselves and what they can contribute for everyone else in their class. And labelling of those skills for them is essential. Young people need to know how to recognise skills in order to learn them and use them. Now, Kat herself is doing this as part of her Into Headship project. And so her big design question at the moment is, how do I level up those skills? What's a logical order, if you like? And how do we revisit skills as we go through school so that the young people are able to practice them? And so she's developed this, and I'll share this really briefly. She's developed this kind of with colleagues, a nursery through to primary 7 progression of meta skills that builds not only the skills in a kind of arbitrary way at all, it builds on the developing the young workforce, on jobs, thinking about careers, helping expose young people to different pathways in life that they may never have thought of. And lots of really concrete I can statements, assessment, self-assessment criteria, so that this youngest child is able to work out for themselves where they stand and what skills they're developing and what that might contribute. And they've also made an effort not just to develop a format for thinking that through, but also to think about new members of staff joining. We've got a great team at Crown Primary School, lots of young new teachers coming in too. And so this documentation that they've created, a little bit of a how-to and a why-to perhaps on why it's so important, means that people are not left playing too long a catch-up game to get on top of what they're doing and how to do it. It's not a checklist approach, and so helping practitioners in their school pick up quickly how to go about integrating this into every learning moment is really key. The learner statement that they ask learners to commit to asks for at least 3 key skills that they've used in a project, along with evidence that they've done it. And so the young people themselves are very self-aware, let alone the staff. And they're even using digital stamps collected in each child's learning profile, where they can reflect on how they've achieved what they've achieved. So, for example, when they're doing a lesson on Japan, for example, a fairly typical kind of project, they'll pick up on some of the skills by identifying how they know what creativity means and what the specific skills are to be creative. Or they might say, what does focusing mean? And then learners need to find out the tasks that help them build those skills. So it's not all down to what the teacher kind of serves up to them, but about what young people identify for themselves as their next steps. There's loads of documentation they've used to inform this. Skills Development Scotland have their agenda, their skills development agenda. There are paper-based profiles, different job categories that they've harvested, if you like, to create this kind of continuum of thinking skills. They've translated it into a schools context as well, which I think is really important. Otherwise, a lot of the developing the young workforce stuff can look like it belongs in the senior secondary school. And what they're showing here at Crown Primary is that making connections between stages, early years and stages of primary school in the world of work is equally important. They see it really as part of an equality agenda. If we don't ask the purpose of learning early on, if we're not really helping kids understand what it takes to thrive in life and in the workplace, then we're missing a trick. And so they see learning skills a bit like cumulative interest in the bank. The earlier we can get those skills learned in the early years and in primary school, the earlier we can have conversations about all those potential pathways that young people can take. It's not just additive, it actually multiplies their ambition and sets that seed that perhaps there's life beyond the four walls they find themselves at the moment. And their four pieces of advice are: teach the language and label it. So the digital stampers work well for doing that. If you're not naming it, then you're not really sure you've got it. Two, they say review it regularly with your team and in your student profiles. Get young people talking about what they've done to achieve their stamps and their successes through skills. Third, get evidence from students to know that they've got that skill and to help you know you're making an impact with that focus. And fourth, they're really keen that people don't see this as being a bit of a dirge or an add-on to the important work of teaching content. They think it's actually one of the things that helps us as teachers and practitioners be even more creative in how we go about teaching content, because the more skills young people have and the more they're able to actually name it, the more responsibility we can give them, which means we can go deeper and broader with projects we undertake in class as the child goes through their school career. Loads of other examples of skills being important, including one at Inverlochie down the road, where they've actually used band culture, as in musical instruments and orchestras, and the band culture that comes from the United States and all those Hollywood movies that we've seen before. It's really about concentration, discipline, deliberate practice, really caring about quality. I can maybe tell you a little bit more about that if you like, but a totally different approach to teaching those skills, but actually the same principle. You've got to be able to call a skill out to be able to know you've got it, and you've also got to know what kinds of tasks lend themselves to getting that skill up. And you'll have heard as well a real tendency towards that psychology from the world of sports, marginal gains. What's the 1% better that I can do in my skill development that's actually going to have a disproportionate impact on my capacity as a learner to take on bigger projects. So fascinating stuff from colleagues in both Crown Primary, Inverlochie, and many other schools too, where skills development is really seen as being as important as content and stuff that people feel they've got to drive through. And at this point, I'll maybe crack on to talk about the third point and share a little bit more about that Inverlochie story, because one of the third element that I wanted to talk to is how you treat curriculum design really as a prototype. And something that emerged through all the work that we were doing with practitioners and listening to their stories, interviewing them in quite great depth about what they were doing, is that none of them talked with, I would say, great confidence that their development was done. Their stories all to them felt incomplete. They felt that they were on a journey, and could I not just come back and talk to them in a few months' time when it had developed a bit more? But what was happening is that they were prototyping, they were trying things out, they were experimenting, they were in perpetual beta, and none of them saw curriculum design as something that would be done and then run. It was something that would have to evolve over time. And it made me think of the kind of curriculum design that my team have undertaken with schools, where that prototyping culture looks messy, but actually the dialogue is incredibly rich. One example from a primary school in Sydney, Australia, that we worked with, that sums up, I think, the messiness, but the beautiful messiness going on in curriculum design amongst many of the practitioners in Scotland. Each one of these boards is one primary school year, and when you look at the year, you'll see these hexagons. Each one of them has either content that they are hoping to achieve, those achievement standards or expectations and outcomes on content, and others are about skill development. And when they layer these up together, they're able to start spotting the pace of the year, the points in the year where they know they're going to have to go at a slower pace, the points of the year where there are events, there are things going on that they can harness, and they can start reorganizing things. And although this is done on the wall with paper, it was never put into a computer. It was never put into a linear document or a Word document, because these walls are living and breathing, and the practitioners talk to each other almost every day about curriculum design when they stare up at the wall and they talk about why they're doing what they're doing and when they're doing it. And that was something that came through really strongly in all the stories around curriculum design. Dialogue is king when it comes to designing great curriculum. And so at Inverlochy Primary School, you had Kirsty Clark, the head teacher, along with 2 music instructors, Karen Thompson, the principal instrumental instructor, and Mark Reynolds, the brass instructor, and with a helping hand from Norman Bolton, who's the music development officer in Highland. And what they've managed to do in pretty short order is establish a tradition, a culture, and it's a culture of looking at things as projects, and all of this really through music. Where it was an exception just a few years ago for someone to play an instrument in Fort William in Inverlochy Primary School, it's now the norm. If you don't play a musical instrument in that school, it's a bit strange. And it all started in Chicago. Lochaber School Wind Band had a bit of a history. It was easy to slot into that wind band culture. They were getting Gold Plus awards at competitions. They were then awarded a scholarship to go to the States, to Chicago, and understand what band culture was all about. And it's really different there. What they saw in Scotland is that numbers were in decline. And the reason they were in decline is that in order to play in the big orchestras, you had to be good. And if you were not quite, if you were just a little bit shy of the standard that was required, then there was no route for you. And that would just mean kids would stop playing. And although that's in music, I think we see it in all subject areas and all disciplines. I'm a modern linguist, and I saw that I felt it learning French and German myself at school. At which point am I going to be fluent enough to call myself a linguist? And if the answer is, well, you're not going to be fluent before you leave school, it's demotivating. So what they instituted with band culture is really about shifting a shift of culture across the whole school. And the culture is about being broad and inclusive. It's about being doors open to the world of music. And what they've discovered is that by giving more ways for young people to participate in group music together, by really focusing on those values of concentration, discipline, deliberate practice, and caring about quality, they've seen an improvement in relationships across the school. Every child's got a story of how they've grown. They've been able to concentrate better. They collaborate better. It's actually impacted on so many other parts of the school. And it's because they start in the difficult points. They don't make compromises on quality, and the expectations are raised as a result of that. And it means that when every child in a primary 5 band, for example, performs, the parents looking on and listening on feel the same emotion as if they were in a national competition, for example. Why? Because the goal is not to play in the high school band one day. The goal is to play today and to do the very best you possibly can today. It's a really rich project, and one that I'm looking forward to expanding upon and sharing in more detail in the future. But I think that the key lesson from this is that it's really important to have that focus. They focused on band culture. So if you're looking at creating curricular change in your school, curriculum is really big. It's a massive thing to think about. And what they did at Inverlochy is they said, we're just going to concentrate on band culture, and focusing and narrowing down on that meant that they were able to upskill incredibly quickly and transfer all their lessons learned to so many other places. I'm aware we've just got, I think we're on our final minute, and there's a rather abrupt end when things come to an end here. So let me just conclude with the final point, which is really about success and redefining success. I'm sorry to rush it because I think it's an important one that probably merits a session on its own, given everything that we are living through at the moment, and realising that success is much harder to define than saying, well, it's about getting 5 A's at higher. Success is not about exam results alone. And this is a point that came through in almost every story, whether it was looking at Winford Primary School, Winford Nursery, sorry, in Glasgow, where teachers themselves redefined what their success was, to look at what the child could bring to the classroom rather than focusing just on curriculum itself. Or whether it's Bucksburn Academy, where they managed to change the perception that all children should remain in school at S5. Bucksburn, a great example of going to college in S5 being seen as a success today, not a failure of the school. And they've managed in Aberdeen to create an environment, changed mindset, where it's what's right for the young person and their route to success rather than what's right for the institution. Schools may like to claim a higher, for example, but if the correct route is something more complex, then it's down to the institution to find that route and help the young people get on it. Sir Ken Robinson's quote is, I think, important to bear in mind. Human resources are like natural resources. They're often buried deep. You have to go looking for them. They're not just lying around on the surface. You have to create the circumstances where they show themselves. I don't know whether the National 5 options on offer really give the depth that we need for every young person in Scotland. And Liz, you shared this with me yesterday. It was mind-blowing. There are 55 National 5 options, but a lot more choice over and above that when you go looking for it.
Yep, over 700 level 5 qualifications that are available to young people, but 55 National 5s that are presented year on year.
And I think that when you look at the level 6 qualifications, the percentage that are hires, it's a tiny percentage of level 6 qualifications in the country that are actually hires themselves. So we have stories from Bucksburn Academy, from Calderglen, from Duncanrig, from primary schools like Dice and Crown. All of them are bucking this idea that somehow success is tied to a very narrow set of examinations, and instead are planning pathways with young people themselves that take them way beyond thinking about what's right maybe for 7% of young people in the country. And we've got to think about those other 93%. The stories that of how they've gone about doing that are all connected really to the 6 points that came before. A lot of it is about rich interdisciplinary learning. A lot of it is about planning thinking skills and making sure that young people leave with a strong sense of self-awareness and confidence in their skills. And that means they're able to take on any discipline that they want to with confidence after they leave school. So this work is really at the beginning rather than at the end. We've been slowed down without a doubt through having to do everything online, and I can't wait to meet practitioners over the months to come to learn more about their stories and share more of their ideas and frameworks. We're going to start launching these towards the end of October with both a full story case study, if you like, with a couple of schools mentioned always. And in addition to that, we'll have some downloadable frameworks, for example, that you can make your own and try yourself. So keep an eye out for those on the Education Scotland website and, of course, on all the various social media around there too. There we go. We've gone slightly over time. I apologise for that. There are too many stories to share in 45 minutes, but I hope it's whet your appetite. And if you have questions, please reach out on social media at notosh or at Ewan McIntosh, and I'll be happy to share and point you in the direction of those schools close to you who are doing great things.
Thanks very much, Ewan. Thank you, folks.